Hello, juniors. Welcome to the new format of the class here. I will be walking through some of the reading this week. We're going to be reading The Diamond as Big as the Ritz for the whole week. I think it's going to be an interesting reading because it's one of Fitzgerald's other works, lesser known works than The Great Gatsby, but it covers an awful lot of the same ideas that Fitzgerald works with in that novel. And so hopefully if you've read the first couple chapters, and you should have, that you're noticing a lot of those same themes, those same concerns, those same topics are coming up. Wealth, identity, happiness, what it means to be successful in America, all these things are coming back up in this story just as they were in The Great Gatsby. What this first class video is going to be like is just me talking a lot about the quotes, and then as the class goes on and we kind of find our sea legs with this online instruction, I'll be involving you a lot more, hopefully getting to a place where the equivalent of the class discussions we would have done in room 406 is taking place. And I think I'll do that by having you comment on the videos on Google Classroom, maybe set up a time for a Google Hangout at some point, but these will all be options that we'll have going forward to make sure that it's not just, a week or several weeks of you hearing me drone on about these stories via Google Classroom videos. Anyways, we'll get started with this, and what I'm going to do is just mark up the different quotes that I've chosen. I'll post these without my markups in a moment here, but just kind of explaining where I see the quotes as coming from, as connecting to The Great Gatsby, and then hopefully, since you've read it, you've formed your own ideas and you can hear some of mine and put those together, or ask your own questions, and we can even use some of those 1 and 2 conversations we may have as a jumping off point for class discussions after this. So the first quote that we have here is young John T. Unger, who had just turned 16, had danced all the latest dances from New York before he put on long trousers. And now for a certain time he was to be away from home. That respect for a New England education, which is the bane of all provincial places, which drains them yearly of their most promising young men, had seized upon his parents. Nothing would suit them but that he should go to St. Midas School near Boston. Hades was too small to hold their darling and gifted son. One thing to note is that the protagonist in this story seems to be pretty similar in a lot of ways to the protagonist, or at least the narrator, of The Great Gatsby, who would be Nick Carraway. Both are young men. Nick Carraway, a good 14 years older by the middle of the novel than John T. Unger, but both young men who are on the cusp of a giant change in their life, who are going from kind of being sheltered, being raised by their families, being maybe even coddled by their families, to young men who are expected to now go into the world, make a name for themselves, build the family reputation, become successful on their own, and achieve, if not their own dreams, the dreams that the country has set forward for them in terms of wealth, status, marriage, those ideas that we talked about over the course of reading the entire Great Gatsby. We get a sense, too, that John T. Unger's family and he himself are similar to the Carraways and Nick Carraway. Nick Carraway came from, I believe it was St. Louis, and or Louisville, I'm sorry. He had been somebody whose family was probably more well off than the average family in the country, probably more well off maybe than 60% of the families, but he wasn't in that 99th percent. And we saw that from the description of who his family was way back in chapter 1 of The Great Gatsby, that they had said that they came from these dukes and earls in England, but actually, as far back as they could trace their family, was around the time of the Civil War, when his grandfather had paid somebody to fight for him while he launched the dry goods business. So it seems like John T. Unger's family is similar in that way, that they don't live in a place that seems particularly kind of noteworthy or classy. We'll talk in a moment about how they live in Hades, which is probably a Greek term for hell there, and all the jokes that go with that. But they're not at the top of society. In fact, we know that they're not because in Hades, like a lot of other provincial places, these places kind of outside of the great cities, send their young men, their promising young men, to these boarding schools on the East Coast. And so they want probably to launch their children into this kind of upper echelon of class and power in America, much the same way that Nick Carraway's family told him, well, we got together and we decided it's okay for you to go and try and sell bonds on Wall Street. That seems like something that would be a respectable thing for a Carraway to do. So we approve. It seems as though John T. Unger's at a younger stage of that in his life, not deciding to kind of go and start his career on Wall Street, but his family is still saying, we're going to send you off to a boarding school so you can be around the right kinds of people. You can learn the right kinds of manners. You can have the education that kind of raises people's eyebrows. Interestingly, the name of the school he gets sent to is St. Midas School, and that probably rings a bell because Midas is famous in mythology for having the golden touch. He was so greedy that he was enchanted so that everything he touched turned to gold. At first, this was a windfall for him and a wonderful thing, but then he touches his daughter and his daughter turns to gold. And he realizes that it's kind of ruined his life to be that concerned with wealth. This obsession with wealth and of turning everything to gold around you or diamonds around you in this story is something that we see throughout it. And I think, kind of going back to The Great Gatsby, to some extent, Gatsby had the same problem. He was somebody who thought a certain amount of wealth, of status, would bring Daisy to him. And clearly, I think one of the biggest tragedies in the book is that Gatsby totally denies that that ship has left, that no matter how wealthy he is, he cannot turn time backwards. He cannot buy Tom's way out of Daisy's life and memories and experiences. So that sort of problem here, what are the limits of money and what does having a lot of money do to you as a person, are ideas that Fitzgerald is still going to be very concerned with and playing with in this story. So next part here. This takes place in the town of Hades, as I noted. And again, there's that joke, is it hot enough for you, that the narrator has stopped laughing at because, or not the narrator, I'm sorry. This is in third person, which is a big change from the first person Nick Carraway narration of The Great Gatsby. But either way, our protagonist, John T. Unger, is from Hades, and it's constantly kind of having to deal with these jokes that he already finds boring. Hades seems like a place that one of the easy ways to think of it may be that maybe Myrtle Wilson came from. And I don't say that to, be distasteful in terms of Myrtle Wilson's death or anything. What I mean is that Hades is a place where class is known, and I think high class is known, but it's not fully understood. And so the first thing we see is the names of the more fashionable preparatory schools and colleges mean very little. Hades is a place where they may know the names of kind of big schools that are important, but they don't know the names of all the schools that are kind of a sign of wealth. So somebody may know, that Harvard is a good university to go to, but they may not know that Vassar is kind of an equally noteworthy place for the moneyed elite on the East Coast or something like that. And so we get a sense that the people of Hades are a little out of touch with what kind of quote unquote true ruling class is. That maybe they don't fully care, but I think the rest of the paragraph tells us that they do in a way. So if we keep reading on here, the inhabitants have been so long out of the world that though they make a show of keeping up to date in dress and manners and literature, they depend to a great extent on hearsay. We see that the inhabitants of Hades, its citizens, make a show of keeping up to date in dress and manners and literature. Will wear the kind of clothes that are in that season or talk about the books that everybody's talking about. But they don't get that organically. they don't get that from being in that class. They get that from hearing about it from other people who maybe are from the fashionable parts of the country, or get it from reading magazines that cover these sorts of things. In the same way that Myrtle Wilson thought that buying a lot of large, expensive furniture and putting it in this small apartment made her look classy, but to an outsider, you're saying, don't you understand how odd that looks? The people of Hades are probably the same, that they're 90% of the way to kind of looking and seeming like they understand what class is, but that last 10%, that 10% that you can't really put your finger on or explain or especially teach to somebody, is still missing. And so just like Myrtle Wilson, you realize she's not truly from East Egg because she has the tabloid Town Tattler out on her coffee table, and nobody would ever read that in East Egg, or at least leave that out if they were reading it. Myrtle Wilson doesn't fully understand that that's a tell from where she is. That seems to be true of Hades as well, but there are constantly these little tells going on that they're not naturally kind of East Egg, old money, ruling class people. And Fitzgerald ends this idea by saying, a function that in Hades would be considered elaborate would doubtless be hailed by Chicago beef princesses perhaps a little tacky. And so finally, the idea of kind of what would pass for incredibly fancy in Hades, be seen as gaudy or tacky, or something out of touch by people who are truly the moneyed elite or truly old money. Fitzgerald seems to be saying that Hades is that sort of place, that at best it read about what class looks like and can get pretty close to it. But again, I think if you need a comparison that can be helpful for understanding the kind of place Hades is, Myrtle Wilson, who desperately wanted to be somebody from Tom's world and bought the things she thought she should have bought to look like she was from Tom's world, but got things wrong as much as she got things right. That seems to be the kind of place Hades is here. So moving on here, we have, again, I think, a deep connection between The Great Gatsby and The Diamond as Big as a Ritz. And that's that both of these stories start off pretty quickly with fatherly advice. I think it's important to note that fathers seem to be an important character in Fitzgerald's work. The Great Gatsby opens with Nick's father's advice to Nick, who then narrates the rest of the story. The novel closes with Gatsby's father attending his funeral. This story opens with John's father's advice to him, and it's interesting to compare what his advice is to Nick's father's advice, which was something along the lines of, remember before you judge anybody that they haven't had all the advantages that you've had in life. John Unger's father's advice is, remember, you are always welcome here. He said, you can be sure, boy, that we'll keep the home fires burning. Perhaps there's a little bit of irony that fires are burning in Hades. Either way, I know, answered John huskily. Don't forget who you are and where you come from, continued his father proudly, and you can do nothing to harm you. You are an Unger from Hades. So I think there's an important idea of identity here that seems to be similar to Nick's father's advice. Nick's father's advice was along the lines of, keep in mind who you are and what you've had, and don't use that against anybody else over the course of your life. I think in reading The Great Gatsby, most of us came to believe that Nick, at best, sometimes followed that advice. But either way, I think it's something that Fitzgerald puts in there for us as readers to help guide us through the novel and ask that question. John Unger's father's advice is a little different here. Don't forget who you are and where you come from. I think that's similar to the idea of advantages, but it also, that idea of where you come from, seems to be saying that there's something noble or important or comforting or valuable about being an Unger from Hades. That if you keep that in mind and don't try to become somebody else, don't succumb to the pressures of society or other people or your own ambitions, that nothing can harm you. And so we do have that sense, at least, of John Unger being sent off with this note that as long as you're true to yourself, as long as you aren't influenced in the bad sorts of ways that probably will happen on the East Coast, you'll be all right. And John Unger's father ends with this comment, you're an Unger from Hades. I think we could read this two ways. One is maybe the kind of cynical, pessimistic way, which is, you can only ever be an Unger from Hades. That having that last name, growing up in that place, means you're never going to be part of old money. And I think we see Gatsby in the same way, kind of struggling with that legacy and realizing no matter how much he earns or what he accomplishes, he can never vault out of new money and back into old money. But we could also read it, I think, in a more optimistic, hopeful way, which is that being an Unger from Hades is enough, that that's the most important part of his identity. It may never let you be old money, but it can let you be happy. And so I think, taking that last part there of his father's advice, basically being, remember, you are an Unger from Hades, and using that to try and figure out what the theme of the story is. What does that mean to remember who you are and where you're from is a good question to keep asking. And I think one that Fitzgerald is constantly asking in The Great Gatsby as well for us. All right. So we finally get to the point where John meets Percy, and Percy is his friend at the St. Midas school who is very kind of, quiet, maybe even withdrawn, private. And I think we understand where that privacy comes from by the end of the second chapter. But I think there's a sense, again, of John Unger kind of having stars in his eyes when he meets somebody like Percy, or maybe even meets any of the boys at St. Midas School, because people like that probably don't exist in Hades. Percy, being the son of the richest man in the world, comes from a very different perspective. And it's funny to read his words and wonder if Percy is bragging or if he's so far out of the orbit of average people or even rich people in this story that he doesn't realize how these statements come off. That to him, they're matter of fact, and to everybody else, it's kind of this grating bravado that just kind of wears on you to hear. Either way, Percy starts by saying, my father is by far the richest man in the world. Again, this idea of father determining identity. And I think, when you're a teenager and your accomplishments are still down the road, personally, you do attach probably a lot of identity to your parents' accomplishments. And then as you become an adult and start to rack up your own accomplishments, those kind of become more a part of who you are. But it's interesting that Percy's identity is clearly wrapped up in his father's. It's not, I'm one of the richest boys in the world. It's, my father is by far the richest man in the world. So he puts that on his father and seems to almost make that his own identity. Oh, said John politely. He could think of no answer to make to this confidence. He considered. That's very nice, but it sounded hollow and was on the point of saying really, but refrained since it would seem to question Percy's statement. Such an astonishing statement could scarcely be questioned. By far the richest, repeated Percy. To me, when I read this part, it sounds so much like that car ride that Nick and Gatsby have in chapter 3, where Gatsby is talking about, oh, this very sad thing happened to me, and I spent some time in India collecting rubies. And I think in the same way, again, John is like Nick. They both sit back and go, yeah, that sounds pretty bizarre, but you know what? This person's sharing something with me that they think is important, and so I'm going to be sensitive to that. It doesn't mean that they don't question it, and it doesn't mean that they don't, kind of roll their eyes when the person isn't watching them. But at the same point, they seem sensitive to the idea that this sort of bragging and maybe even lying is a part of this new world that one just is expected to kind of put up with in a lot of cases. Either way, they're people that are confided in, and confided in by probably the most second important characters in their stories. And again, that seems like something that Fitzgerald likes to use in his writing. Have a main character who's not kind of having secrets him or herself, but constantly being told the secrets of other characters and wondering what to do with them. I think that's another big connection we can see in these works. All right. And so finally here, last quote from chapter 1, he must be very rich, said John simply. I'm glad. I like very rich people. The richer a fellow is, the better I like him. There was a look of passionate frankness upon his dark face. I visited the Schnitzler Murphys last Easter. Vivian Schnitzler Murphy has rubies as big as hen's eggs and sapphires that were like globes with lights inside of them. I love jewels, agreed Percy enthusiastically. Excuse me. Of course, I wouldn't want anyone at school to know about it, but I've got quite a collection myself. I used to collect them instead of stamps. The difference between Percy and John's words here are really important to note. John seems to almost be kind of fawning over the rich people, falling at their feet and saying, "That's wonderful, you're so rich. I like very rich people. The richer a fella is, the better I like him." These are statements that, you know, if they're not sarcastic, seem so over the top that they're almost laughable. And again, maybe that's a result of John being all of 16 years old in this story. But he's clearly somebody who, if you tell him how rich you are, he gets stars in his eyes and says, "Wow, you must be such a great person. I'm so happy I got to talk to you. What's it like? Tell me more." Somebody who's in awe of it and probably a little submissive when he's around people he thinks are going to maybe bring him into the fold. He also names drops here, which I think we see Nick doing when he's listing all the names at Gatsby's parties. The Schnitzler Murphys, sorry, here, I mean, probably another made up name from Fitzgerald's Rolodex, but still one that clearly John is bringing up. He's not saying, "Oh, the Ungers of Hades, my father." He's picking this name of someone else he knew. Um, Percy has a different kind of approach to this. Percy doesn't seem to fawn over it. He actually has the sense of modesty. Whether that's real or faked, we can debate. But he says, "I wouldn't want anyone at school to know about it, but I've got quite a collection myself of jewels." And so we see Percy, I think, flipping the tables on John here. John wants to talk about how great it is that Percy's rich and what Percy can teach him about being rich and the other rich people he's met. Percy clearly comes from a different side of that looking glass. And so to Percy, it's, "Yeah, I didn't want to bring it up, but dot, 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 I collect jewels instead of stamps." So again, I think we see that sense that maybe at this point, Percy is the kind of person John wants to become. Percy, because he's probably the richest boy in the world, doesn't have ambitions to be anybody else. And in that way, maybe he's closer to the epitome of John's father's advice. But I think we'll see Percy, and especially Percy's father, to be pretty heartless, evil characters, even by the end of chapter 2. So, moving into chapter 2, we get a new setting. And I think it's interesting that just like the setting of East and West Egg is introduced in chapter 1 of The Great Gatsby and the Valley of the Ashes and New York City in chapter 2, we kind of have the same switcheroo of settings in the first couple chapters of this story. So we get the village of Fish here, and I'll read the first quote. "An immense distance under the sky crouched the village of Fish, minute, dismal, and forgotten. There were 12 men, so it was said, in the village of Fish, 12 somber and inexplicable souls who sucked lean milk from the almost literally bare rock upon which a mysterious populatory force had begotten them. They had become a race apart, these 12 men of Fish, like some species developed by an early whim of nature, which on second thought had abandoned them to struggle and extermination." A lot going on here, but I think there's clear biblical allegory in place. The idea of 12, there being 12 apostles, things like this are there. And then the idea of souls who sucked a lean milk from the almost literally bare rock. That idea of Moses getting water from rocks for the Israelites, the Exodus, you know, Christ told to create food from rocks by Satan in the New Testament. These are ideas that, to an audience deeply familiar with the Bible, would jump out at them. And then finally, we have what seems like almost a sort of Garden of Eden reference. They had become a race apart, these 12 men of fish, like some species developed by an early whim of nature, creation, which on second thought had abandoned them to struggle and extermination, being kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And so I think we have to ask if, all right, these 12 men of fish, who are kind of these humans who must suffer and make sense of the world, if they're in the world outside of Eden, what is Eden? And I think the obvious answer in this chapter is Eden is the house that Percy lives in, and Percy's family lives in. And so are they Adam? Are they God? Are they Satan? You know, it's an interesting question to ask, but I think um, there's a lot more allusion in this story, especially to things like the Bible, than there was in The Great Gatsby. And that seems to be just coming from the idea that this is, in some ways, a more fantastic, fantasy driven story than The Great Gatsby. The Great Gatsby, I think, was very realistic, that very few things happen that seem to be supernatural or kind of unbelievable in our own world. In this story, it's, I mean, over the top from the end of the first chapter. So, moving on with this discussion of fish being this kind of biblical reference point, we see the observation of this pointless and preposterous phenomenon had become a sort of cult. I think that's an important word there among the men of fish. To observe, that was all. There remained in them none of the vital quality of illusion that would make them wonder or speculate, else religion might have grown up around these mysterious visitations. So, the 12 men who, every 6 months see this train arrive, see Percy get off it, see Percy move off into the darkness. It's interesting that it seems like such a biblical religious allusion, but then at the same time, Fitzgerald says that these 12 men of fish um, don't wonder or speculate about what's happening because otherwise a religion might have grown up around these mysterious visitations. So, would somebody like Percy kind of be a false idol or a false prophet or maybe even, somebody satanic? It's a good question to ask, but we're still grappling with that idea of there being religious imagery here. But the men of fish were beyond all religion. The barest and most savage tenets of even Christianity could gain no foothold on that barren rock, so there was no altar, no priest, no sacrifice. Only each night at 7, the silent concourse by the shanty depot, a congregation who lifted up a prayer of dim, anemic wonder. And so again, I think if Fitzgerald started walking up to that idea of them being religious illusions, confusingly, he totally walks that back. The men of fish are beyond all religion, or at least beyond Christianity. And they don't practice any sort of religious rituals there. I think another thing to bring up is maybe the kind of combination of religion and money that we see in The Great Gatsby, in that I think it's chapter 10 when George Wilson is kind of, or maybe 11 when George Wilson is, wait a minute, there weren't 11 or 12 chapters. I'm sorry. Probably 7 or 8. I was trying to remember what the last couple chapters were. Um, when George Wilson is kind of in the aftermath of Myrtle's death, and he's talking about the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg being God's eyes. We talked about how when Michaelis tells him that's an advertisement, George, that maybe to George and maybe to many characters, advertisements, capitalism, money have become God now. That wasn't just kind of a statement out of George Wilson's madness, that George Wilson was being very serious in saying that that's what everybody was worshiping, the idea of business, advertisement, success. And so maybe that's the same thing here. If they're heretics, maybe the parts of religion that these 12 men of fish reject is the kind of unbelievable wealth and ambition and heartlessness that's grown up in Percy's family because of that. All right. The idea of race, I think, is an interesting point in this story too. And I know we talked a little bit about whether or not we could read The Great Gatsby with a bit of a racist overtone in class. This story probably complicates that question because in The Great Gatsby, the most we heard from characters of color were them being referred to as Negroes. They didn't have names. They didn't have much dialogue. I think the only place a character of color speaks is after Myrtle Wilson's death when he's giving testimony to the cop there. But if that made Fitzgerald troublesome, I think this story makes him more troublesome. And again, we get the sense that Fitzgerald at best makes characters of color, especially black male characters, just kind of characters in the background, which is troubling. So two Negroes dressed in glittering livery, such as one sees in pictures of royal processions in London, were standing at attention beside the car, and as the two young men dismounted from the buggy, they were greeted in some language which the guest could not understand, but which seemed to be an extreme form of the Southern Negro's dialect. We'll realize later that that the house that Percy lives in is basically its own world, even with its own language. But again, I don't think we can get past the idea of servitude, maybe even slavery, in these images. Dressed in glittering livery, such as one sees in pictures of royal processions in London, and helping the boys into the car, and then whether it's Fitzgerald or John Unger seeing it this way, um, the Southern Negro's dialect. I mean, in the 20s, the Jim Crow South was very, very alive and real. The Emancipation Proclamation had happened quite a few decades before, but the idea that de facto slavery wasn't still in place, I think history tells us, very unfortunately, that was common, that Jim Crow laws and general policies of discrimination, violence, even up to lynching, were still in place. And I think that makes Fitzgerald kind of a troubling author to keep admiring if you do, because the more we read from him, it seems like the more he's unwilling to actually give a full life and personality and sense of humanity to characters of color. So I thought it was noteworthy that he seemed to be kind of falling short in that regard again here. If the car was any indication of what John would see, he was prepared to be astonished indeed. The simple piety prevalent in Hades, excuse me, as the earnest worship of and respect for the riches is the first article of its creed. Had John felt otherwise than radiantly humble before them, his parents would have turned away in horror at the blasphemy. So again, we get this sense maybe of religion and class and wealth all turning into the same thing in America for Fitzgerald. The idea of simple piety, I think, goes back to that almost ignorance of what the kind of ultra wealthy are and want to be and experience in Hades. It seems to be that the people of Hades have earnest worship and respect for the riches, that they do see that as a sign of success, but that at a certain point it becomes kind of excessive, maybe even perverted, in the sense that the wealth is no longer about being successful, it's about being greedy. And so, while John feels humble when he's seeing how wealthy Percy's family is, he notes that his parents would have turned away in horror at the blasphemy, that this would have been so extravagant, so opulent, that John's parents would have seen it as a vice rather than a virtue, as something wrong with people to have that much money and to be that kind of forthright with it, than to maybe just show it as a sign of success otherwise. The worst is over, said Percy, squinting out the window. It's only 5 miles from here, on our own road, tapestry brick all the way. This belongs to us. This is where the United States ends, Father says. Are we in Canada? We are not. We're in the middle of the Montana Rockies. That you are now on the only 5 square miles of land in the country that's never been surveyed. So kind of like East Egg being this impenetrable, uncolonized area that was just kind of gifted to the old money in a sense. I think we see Percy saying the same thing. The worst is over. I don't think that's just the trip there. I think Percy's also referring to everything outside of this compound that he lives on, that's the worst and this is the best. This belongs to us. The idea of complete and total ownership, the idea that money truly lets you own things, maybe even people, maybe dreams, maybe eternal life. These are all things that seem incredibly important here. And this is where the United States ends. The idea that government or community is not in place as far as this goes. Are we in Canada? No, we are not. We're in the middle of the Montana Rockies, again, the West, a place that's kind of uncolonized, a place that's still maybe the wilderness, the frontier. But you're on the only 5 square miles of land in the country that's never been surveyed, never been recorded, never been turned into a map there. And again, the idea of something not being written down being important, I think that gets back to the idea of culture. I just got those brief little clicks in my ear from my AirPods dying that I'm using as a microphone to record these. So I'm going to wrap this up just a little early. I wanted to get through a little more in chapter 2. I'll include that in tomorrow's video. with 3 and 4. But I hope that this is a good start. And again, I want to get you guys more involved, so don't expect every class to be like this. Please use this to get started with 1 and 2. That'll be due, I believe, Wednesday night, although I'll double check that on Google Classroom. And let me know if you have any questions by either emailing me, making a private comment, or if you feel like it would be helpful to your classmates to ask a question for everybody, make a public comment on the Google Classroom page. So I hope you're doing well. I hope you're safe, healthy, still kind of figuring out how to stay sane with the sorts of things going on both outside and inside your world, and that I get to see you soon because I miss being in class. All right, have a good one.